Hey guys, tonight we're opening a door that most people who love the Little House story have never thought to look behind. Because there is a woman at the centre of those books who almost never breaks. Ma folds the clothes. Ma keeps the girls clean. Ma tells Laura to sit still, to be proper, to be good. And because Laura wrote her that way, and because millions of readers loved what Laura gave them, America learned to remember Caroline Ingalls as something close to a symbol. Steady. Ordered. Unshakable. The woman beside Pa's fiddle. The woman who could turn a terrible year into a survivable one by the quiet, relentless force of her own refusal to come apart. That woman is real. Laura did not invent her mother's steadiness from nothing, but she wrote it the way you write something you love very much and are also afraid to look at directly. She gave us the strength without always giving us the cost. She gave us the composure without always explaining what built it. And what built it began long before Laura was born. It began in a Wisconsin Territory township in the autumn of 1844, when a little girl named Caroline Quiner woke up into a household that had been permanently changed by a lake storm, and found that the world was going to keep asking things of her, whether she was ready or not. She was 5 years old, and that was just the beginning of what the family record would ask her to carry. Tonight, we're going back to the beginning. Not to a little house in the big woods, not to the first chapter of any book, but to the family that existed before Laura could narrate it, and to the losses that shaped the woman Laura would one day need her mother to be. Before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, the real ones, the ones behind the famous ones, the ones about women whose grief was so well managed that history mistook it for grace, stay with me and subscribe. This channel is built for exactly this kind of history. Now, let us go back to the beginning. December 12th, 1839, Brookfield Township, Waukesha County, Wisconsin Territory. A woman named Charlotte Tucker Quiner gave birth to her 5th child. A girl. They named her Caroline Lake Quiner. And at that moment, no one in that room had any particular reason to believe this child was going to be anything other than what her family was. A working household on the American frontier, striving toward a life that was never quite arrived at without significant effort. But that 5th child would grow up to become one of the most famous mothers in American literary history, not because of what she accomplished, because of what she endured, and because her daughter was watching. Wisconsin Territory in 1839 was not the romantic landscape the word frontier sometimes conjures in the American imagination. The entire territory held fewer than 31,000 people. Spread across forests and prairies and lake shores, those families were building something from almost nothing, with tools that were frequently inadequate for the task, in a climate that did not accommodate error. Milwaukee, roughly 15 miles east of Brookfield Township, was itself still a young and unsteady town of perhaps 1,700 souls. There were no railroads in Wisconsin Territory yet. There were no telegraph lines. There was no quick way to summon help or rescue or even reliable information. There was land, and there was work, and there was weather, and there was whatever your neighbours could spare when things went badly. Henry Newton Quiner, Caroline's father, had been born in Connecticut in 1807. He was part of that steady migration of New England families moving west through New York and Ohio and into the territories beyond, each family believing that the next stretch of land would finally provide what the last one had withheld. He had married Charlotte Tucker, born in Vermont in 1809, and together they had built a household in Brookfield Township that was neither wealthy nor desperate, but lived firmly in the space that most frontier families knew best, always working, frequently uncertain, and quietly unwilling to display either one in front of the community. Henry operated what the historical record describes as a trading post or general store, a modest enterprise that placed the family at the centre of local commerce without elevating them above it. He also worked, at times, the commercial networks of the Great Lakes. Men who lived near those waters in the 1840s often developed complicated relationships with them. The lakes provided trade, passage, income, and connection to eastern markets. They also took without warning and without any particular interest in who was left behind. Charlotte Tucker Quiner was, by every account available to historians, a woman of serious educational intention. She is documented as literate and as someone who treated schooling as a household priority, even when money was short. She would later marry a schoolteacher and run a household that made learning non-negotiable. In a period when women's inner lives were rarely committed to the historical record, what survives of Charlotte suggests a woman who understood that knowledge was one of the few possessions a difficult world could not easily remove from you. She passed that understanding to her children, and Caroline absorbed it more deeply than most. By the time Caroline was born in December of 1839, the Quiner household already held 4 other children. Joseph was 13, Martha was approximately 10 or 11, Henry Jr. was around 8, Thomas was 5, and now Caroline made 5. She would not be the last. Eliza Ann arrived in 1842. The youngest, also named Charlotte after her mother, came in 1844. 7 children in total, 7 bodies to clothe, feed, educate, and keep safe in a world that offered guarantees about none of those things. This is the household Caroline opened her eyes into. Not the composed, almost mythological household of the Little House books, a real one, full of noise and sibling rivalry, and the perpetual hard arithmetic of how much firewood was left, how long the winter would last, whether Henry's latest trading voyage had returned enough to cover what the family needed. There was love in that house. That is not in question. But love on the Wisconsin frontier in the 1840s was not a soft or uncomplicated arrangement. It was practical. It was expressed through labour and through showing up, and through the unspoken agreement that everyone in a household contributed to the household's survival, and that weakness was a private matter to be managed discreetly. Caroline grew up breathing that air. She was learning its grammar before she had any words for it. She was watching her mother manage the house with the calm authority of a woman who understood that visible panic was a luxury no frontier wife could afford. She was watching her older brothers begin to take on the practical roles the household required of male children as soon as they were large enough to hold a tool or carry a load. She was watching her older sisters absorb the rhythms of cooking and sewing, and the 1,000 small acts of domestic maintenance that kept a frontier home from unravelling at its edges. And she was still young enough that much of this registered simply as the texture of ordinary life. The human brain, especially a child's brain, is built to assume continuity. What has been will continue to be. The father who comes home at the end of a trading journey will come home again from the next one. The household that is standing today will be standing next year. That is not naivety. That is the brain protecting itself, protecting its ability to function. But the world does not always honour that protection. Henry Quiner was a man who appears in the historical record with less fullness than his significance to this story deserves. He is not a figure who left letters or diaries or detailed accounts of his interior life. What remains of him is primarily an outline, the dates, the location, the profession, the family he built with Charlotte. But outlines can carry enormous weight. We know that Henry was present enough in his children's lives that his absence became a defining event for all of them, including the youngest children who would barely remember him. We know that Charlotte, who managed to hold the family together after he was gone, and who survived him by many decades, had chosen this man and organised her life around him. We know that the older children, Joseph at 18 in 1844, and Martha and Henry Jr. and Thomas, were old enough to carry real memories of their father, real conversations, real days worked alongside him, real seasons in which his presence was the anchor of the household, and we know that Caroline, born in December of 1839, had approximately 5 years. 5 years. That is the number. Not enough to have built a complete record of him. Not enough to have asked the kinds of questions an older child might ask. But enough to know a father's voice. Enough to know whether the arms that lifted you were strong. Enough to know that the person who sat at the head of the table belonged there and was not simply passing through. 5 years is enough to understand that someone is present. It is not enough to understand what it means when they are gone forever. That understanding takes much longer. Sometimes it takes a lifetime of carrying something without a name for it. The year 1844 was when everything changed for the Quiner family. In the autumn of that year, Henry Newton Quiner was lost on Lake Michigan. He had been travelling, returning from a trading voyage, by what the historical record can reconstruct, when a storm came in off the lake. The exact date is not preserved in any surviving document. The specific vessel he was aboard has not been confirmed in the records that historians have been able to locate. What the record can say, clearly, and with the support of multiple biographical sources, is that Henry Quiner drowned in Lake Michigan sometime in the autumn of 1844, and that he was not recovered. No body, no homecoming, no neat ending with the grief contained in a single visible event. Just the news, arriving somehow to the Brookfield household, that the man who had left on a trading voyage was not going to return from this one. Charlotte was 36 years old. She had 7 children. The youngest, baby Thomas Lewis Quiner, had arrived just the year before. He was barely a year old when his father went out on the lake and did not come back. Caroline was 5 years old, nearly 6 in fact, just weeks away from her December birthday. Old enough to know her father's face, old enough to understand that something in the household had permanently changed, not old enough to carry the full weight of what that change would demand of her for the rest of her life, depending on the precise month of the drowning. Old enough to know something terrible had happened, too young to hold the full weight of what it meant. There is a particular quality of grief that arrives in early childhood and never quite leaves, not because it stays sharp forever, but because it arrives before the mind has the architecture to properly process it, and so it settles in the body instead. It becomes a kind of atmospheric pressure, a baseline understanding that what seems permanent can stop without warning. A father can leave on a Tuesday and become a record by Wednesday, not a presence, a record, a name attached to a date, attached to a lake. Caroline Quiner, at 5 years old, received that information without the capacity to understand it fully, and without any framework in her world that would help her process it safely. Because that framework did not exist. The Protestant frontier community of Brookfield Township in 1844 had rituals for public mourning. The widow wore black. The household withdrew from certain social obligations for a designated period. The community gathered and offered practical support, shared food, shared labour, the agreed understanding that the family in crisis would be assisted until it could stand on its own again. These were not small things. They provided structure in a moment when structure was the only thing standing between a family and collapse. But what they did not provide, what did not yet exist in any form available to a Wisconsin frontier family in 1844, was a language or a space for the private, ongoing, unresolved grief of a 5-year-old girl who no longer had a father. The community helped Charlotte survive. Nobody was equipped to help Caroline understand. And so she watched her mother, Charlotte Quiner, widowed at 35 with 7 children, in a territory that had no widow's pension, no insurance system, no formal financial safety net, faced a practical problem of enormous and immediate urgency: how to keep 7 children alive. Under Wisconsin territorial law, a widow held what was called dower rights, a legal entitlement to 1/3 of the husband's real estate for the duration of her life. It was something. It was not a foundation. Joseph, now 19 years old, stepped into the role the household now required of him. He became the practical anchor of the family's daily survival, the presence in the house that Charlotte could rely on, the older son doing what older sons on the frontier were expected to do when fathers were no longer present. The community of Brookfield organised itself around the family in the quiet, practical ways of frontier Protestant communities: food sharing, labour exchange, the understood agreement of people who lived close enough to each other to know that the next crisis could arrive at any of their doors, and that building a safety net for one another was the only kind of safety net any of them had. Charlotte kept the family together. She kept the children in school. She maintained the household standing in the community. She kept the work going through whatever means were available to her. And in doing all of this, she demonstrated something to her daughter Caroline, something that was never spoken out loud, never framed as a lesson, never delivered as instruction. She demonstrated that grief and function are not opposites, that they can inhabit the same body, that when children are watching, and there is bread to be made and wood to be brought in, and younger siblings to be tended, then grief folds itself into the work. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for a designated space. It keeps its head down and it keeps moving, because stopping is not an option that the arithmetic allows. Carolyn was watching all of this. She was 5 years old, and she was watching. And the lessons she learned were not the spoken kind. They were the kind absorbed through years of observation, years of watching a woman manage an impossible situation with visible control, years of understanding. At some level she could not articulate that the right response to catastrophe was to maintain order, to keep the house clean, to keep the children presentable, to keep moving. Those lessons did not leave her. They went with her into adulthood. They went with her into marriage. They went with her into a covered wagon heading across the Iowa Prairie, with 4 small daughters and a husband full of hope. And eventually they went into her daughters' books, dressed up as strength, named as character, celebrated as the defining quality of pioneer womanhood. But underneath the celebration was the original lesson, which was not a lesson about strength at all. It was a lesson about survival, about what you do when the person who was supposed to be there is not there anymore, and the world does not pause to accommodate your grief, and children are watching, and supper still needs to be made. That is what Caroline Quiner learned before she was old enough to understand what she was learning. That is what she would carry into the little house in the big woods. That is what Laura would one day mistake for Serenity. Charlotte Quiner managed the household alone for roughly 3.5 years after Henry's death. And then, in the early part of 1849, she remarried. His name was Frederick Holbrook. He was a schoolteacher. Caroline was 9 years old. The arrival of Frederick Holbrook brought a different kind of stability to the Quiner household. Not a replacement for what had been lost, because the children were old enough to know that some replacements are not possible, but a practical reassertion that the household had a future, that Charlotte had chosen to keep building even now, even after what the lake had taken. Frederick Holbrook valued education in the way that schoolteachers do, not as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete daily commitment. He ran or was associated with local schools. He brought a structured intellectual seriousness to a household that Charlotte had already made as educated as her circumstances allowed. For Caroline, who had already demonstrated the kind of careful, attentive observation that would define her throughout her life, this new arrangement mattered. She was the daughter of a woman who valued literacy as a form of protection. She was the stepdaughter of a man who had made literacy his profession and his life's work. And she was, as would become clear in the years that followed, a young woman who intended to do something concrete with that inheritance. Because Caroline Quiner was going to become a teacher, before she was Ma Ingalls, before the covered wagons and the prairie winters and the babies and the years that would eventually become America's most beloved children's book series, she was going to stand in front of a classroom in Concord, Wisconsin, and pass on what she had worked so hard to receive. That detail matters more than it might initially seem. A woman who became a teacher had decided, in the face of everything the first decade of her life had demonstrated about the instability of the world, to invest in the permanence of knowledge, to believe that what you know cannot be taken the way everything else can be taken. Her father had been taken. Her household security had been taken. Her childhood sense of continuity had been taken on an autumn day in 1844 when a lake storm made a record out of a man. But knowledge remained. Knowledge could be passed forward. And Caroline Quiner, at some point in her late teenage years, standing in a schoolroom in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, in front of other people's children, was already practicing the particular kind of strength that Laura would later write into American legend. The strength of someone who had already learned the cost of being unprotected, and who had decided that the only reasonable response was to give everyone around her the best possible preparation for the world she already knew could turn on you without warning. Tonight, we have stepped into the world before Ma Ingalls. We have seen the household where Caroline Quiner was born, full, working, held together by a man who travelled and a woman who managed, and 7 children who were growing into whatever the frontier required of them. We have looked directly at the autumn of 1844, when the lake took Henry Quiner and left Charlotte with 7 children and no safety net, and we have understood that what 5-year-old Caroline learned in the years that followed was not a lesson about strength. It was a lesson about continuation, about the difference between being destroyed by loss and being permanently shaped by it. And we have begun to see, in Caroline's decision to become a teacher before she became a wife and mother, the earliest visible trace of the woman Laura would one day write into American memory. But the losses were not finished yet, not even close. In the next chapter, we go deeper into what happened after 1844, into the brothers the Quiner family kept losing, into the particular silence that surrounded those losses, and into the young woman who was absorbing all of it and building, without realizing it, the emotional architecture of one of the most quietly complicated mothers in American literary history. There is a sentence that appears nowhere in the Little House books. It is a sentence that Caroline Quiner lived with for years before she ever became Ma Ingalls, before she ever stood at a stove on the Kansas prairie, or pressed her daughter's dresses for Sunday church. It is a sentence that shaped everything about the woman Laura would one day love and idealize and write into American memory. The sentence is this: the men in this family keep dying, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, reliably, in the way that the frontier kept its own brutal accounting. Father first, then brothers, one by one, across a span of years that stretched from Caroline's earliest childhood into the decade that ought to have been her most settled. The drowning of Henry Quiner in 1844 was the beginning. It was not the end. And what happened in the years between that autumn death and the February morning in 1860, when a 20-year-old Caroline Quiner became Caroline Ingalls, those years are the hidden foundation of everything that came after. Here is what 5 years of Charlotte Quiner's widowhood actually looked like. Not the broad outline of survival, which is the version history most often allows women, the specific, daily, grinding texture of it. The Quiner household in Brookfield Township after 1844 operated under a logic that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with mathematics. Charlotte had 7 children, 7 mouths, 7 bodies that needed clothing through Wisconsin winters cold enough to kill livestock. 7 children who needed to be presentable enough to hold the family's social standing in a community where reputation was one of the few currencies that didn't require a man's signature to spend. Joseph, at 18, became the household's working anchor, hunting, trading, doing what his father had done to the extent that an 18-year-old could replicate a grown man's economic role. He was not his father. He could not be. But he was present, and in 1844 Wisconsin, presence was its own kind of salvation. Martha and the older children absorbed more of the domestic labour. Younger children did what younger children on the frontier did. They learned quickly that their helpfulness or their uselessness was not a neutral thing. It either added to the household or it subtracted from it. Caroline was 5, then 6, then 7. She was in the middle of this household, old enough to be useful, young enough that she could still have been sheltered from the full weight of what was happening around her. She was not sheltered. Frontier households did not shelter children from economic reality, because they could not afford to. A child who didn't understand that wood had to be conserved, that food had to be stretched, that shoes were repaired and re-repaired before they were replaced. That child was a liability. Knowledge was protection. And Charlotte Quiner, who had already demonstrated a deep investment in the intellectual lives of her children, was not about to raise children who didn't understand the world they lived in. So, Caroline understood. By the time she was 7 or 8, she understood exactly what her father's absence had cost. She understood it in the quality of the food at the table in lean months. She understood it in the faces of her older siblings when something broke that they couldn't afford to repair. She understood it in the way her mother moved through a room, with the particular efficient precision of a woman who had made peace with the fact that every minute either accomplished something or it didn't, and there was no time for the ones that didn't. What she did not understand, what no one in that household had the language or the cultural permission to say out loud, was what it felt like. Because this is the part that the Little House books never quite reach, and it is the part that matters most for understanding who Ma Ingalls really was. In 1840s Protestant frontier Wisconsin, grief had a public face and a private one. The public face was correct and well defined. A widow wore mourning dress, black for a prescribed period. The household withdrew from certain social celebrations. The community observed the loss with formal respect. Church provided the theological framework. Death was God's will, suffering was a test of faith, and to question either was to demonstrate insufficient trust in divine providence. This was not cruelty exactly. It was the architecture that a community without hospitals, without professional support, without any modern infrastructure for managing psychological pain had built for itself. You ritualized grief enough to acknowledge it. Then you set it aside because a household that lingered in grief was a household that didn't finish the harvest, and a household that didn't finish the harvest suffered for it before spring arrived. The private face of grief in this culture was, therefore, almost entirely invisible. You did not speak of it at length. You did not revisit it in casual conversation. You trusted in God's plan, you got back to work, and if the loss sat in your chest like something that would never fully dissolve, that was your private business, and the frontier had no patience for private business that slowed the work. Caroline Quiner absorbed this framework completely, not because she was suppressing something, not because she was performing composure for an audience, but because she was a child, and children learn what their world teaches, and her world taught her that sorrow was a private interior thing that had no business appearing in the daily operation of a functioning household. Decades later, Laura Ingalls Wilder would write about a mother who never cried in front of her children, a mother who managed fear with songs, a mother who could receive terrible news and translate it almost immediately into some form of practical action. Scholars like John E. Miller, in his 1998 study Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, have noted that the Ma of the novels is partly a literary construction, that Laura idealized her mother's composure and softened the actual psychological complexity of what Caroline's life required of her. And Miller is right, but the composure was not invented. It was learned. On the floor of a Brookfield Township household, between the ages of 5 and 9, in 5 years of watching Charlotte Quiner hold 7 children together by sheer force of managed calm. Then, in the early part of 1849, Frederick Holbrook arrived. What changed was not what people assume changes when a widow remarries. A new husband on the frontier was not a rescue, it was a reorganization. Charlotte had kept the household functioning. She did not need saving. What Frederick Holbrook brought was something more specific and, in the long run, more consequential than economic relief. He brought the intellectual life of a schoolteacher into a household that was already disposed toward education. Frederick was associated with local schools. He valued formal learning with the particular intensity of a man who had made it his life's work. Under his presence in the household, the distinction between home and schoolroom began to blur in the best possible way. Books were not luxuries, conversation had intellectual content, and the Quiner children were expected to develop their minds with the same seriousness that they were expected to develop their practical skills. For Caroline, now 9 years old, this mattered in a way it might not have mattered for every child in the household. Because Caroline was the kind of learner who paid attention to everything, not just what was being taught, to how, to why, to the difference between a teacher who commanded a room and one who lost it, to the way information could be organized so that a child who had never encountered it before could still find their way through it. She was studying the craft without knowing she was studying it, and within the next several years, the student would become the teacher. Caroline Quiner stood in front of a schoolroom in Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, and taught other people's children. The specific year is not pinned precisely in the surviving record. What is documented through William T. Anderson's biographical research is that Caroline worked as a teacher at a subscription school, the standard model of rural education in 1850s Wisconsin, where families paid directly for the schooling their children received, and where the teacher's authority rested entirely on their own competence and personal presence, because there was no institutional structure behind them to lend it. Subscription school teaching in 1850s Wisconsin was not a comfortable or secure occupation. It was physically demanding. One-room schoolhouses in Wisconsin winters required both intellectual and practical management. It was financially modest, and it required a young woman to command a room of children of varying ages, varying preparation, and varying enthusiasm for being there. Caroline did it. That is the fact. And the fact is not small. A girl who had lost her father at 5 who had watched her mother hold a household together through years of genuine hardship, who had grown up in a culture that asked women to manage everything internally and project stability outward. That girl had become a young woman who could stand in a cold schoolroom in Concord, Wisconsin, and hold the attention of 30 children. She had practiced composure for so long that it had become a skill. She had absorbed the lesson of her mother's household so deeply that she could now export it, and she was good at it. The historical record, thin as it is on the interior details of Caroline's young adulthood, gives us no evidence of failure in this role, only the trajectory of a capable young woman who taught until she married. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most people who love the Little House books have never fully reckoned with. While Caroline was teaching in Jefferson County, the Ingalls family had settled in the same region. Charles Philip Ingalls had been born in Cuba, New York in January of 1836. His family was part of the same great movement of New England families pushing west, the same current that had brought Henry and Charlotte Quiner to Wisconsin a decade earlier. By the late 1850s, the Ingalls and Quiner families occupied overlapping social territory in Jefferson County. They were the kind of neighbouring families who knew each other through church, through community events, through the tight social networks of small Wisconsin towns where everybody knew everybody's business, and young women and young men of marriageable age were inevitably observed. Charles Ingalls, by every account that survives, was charming. He was musical. He played the fiddle with genuine talent, and in a world before recorded sound, a man who could play an instrument at a party was a man who filled a room with warmth and drew people toward him. He was funny. He was hopeful in the way that men who believe in their own ability to build something tend to be hopeful. He was physically capable, confident, and full of plans. He was, in short, everything that makes a young woman fall in love. And he was also something else. He was restless. He was a man who looked at a good situation and wondered what was over the next ridge. He was a man whose ambitions kept pointing west, always west, toward the next piece of land that might finally be the right land, the land that would reward his effort with the security he kept believing was just ahead. Caroline Quiner had grown up in a household built by a man who left. Her father had left on a trading voyage and become a record. Now she was 20 years old, standing in a Jefferson County schoolroom and falling in love with a man whose defining quality was that he kept moving. Whether she understood the pattern consciously, whether any 20-year-old woman in 1859 would have had the distance to see it, the historical record cannot say. What it can say is what she did. On February 1st, 1860, in Concord, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, Caroline Lake Quiner and Charles Philip Ingalls were married. She was 20 years old, he was 24, and somewhere in that decision, the decision of a woman who had already watched the men in her family become absences to marry a man whose restlessness was already visible, there is a question that the Little House books never ask directly. Did she know? Not whether she loved him. She loved him. That is clear from every account of their life together. But did some part of her, built from 5 years of watching Charlotte hold a household together after the lake took her father, understand that she was choosing a life that would require a particular kind of strength, that the fiddle and the plans and the next ridge and the next piece of land were beautiful, and also that beauty did not pay the rent when the crops failed? That hope was a wonderful travelling companion, and also that the woman who packed the wagon was always the one who had to figure out what happened after hope ran out. She walked into that marriage with her eyes open. She had too much history not to, and within the next 15 years, 2 things would happen that would test every lesson her childhood had given her. The first was a son who would not live long enough to be remembered by most of the people who loved the Little House books. The second was a daughter who would grow up watching her mother survive it. The first 2 years of a marriage can tell you almost everything you need to know about the next 40. Not because the early years are the truest years, but because they are the years before habit hardens into assumption, before 2 people stop noticing each other and start simply living alongside each other. In those first 2 years, you see each other clearly. You see what the other person does when things go wrong. Caroline saw what Charles did when things went wrong. He made a new plan. That is not a criticism. It is a description. and for a woman who had spent the first decade of her life understanding that the world does not honour plans, it was the first real test of everything her childhood had built in her. They were in Pepin County, Wisconsin by 1863, on a piece of land Charles had chosen, with the confidence of a man who believed in his own ability to read a landscape and know what it could produce. The land was real. The hope was real. And then, on January 10th, 1865, their first daughter arrived, Mary Amelia Ingalls, fair-haired, serious, the child who would become the gentle elder sister of the Little House books, the one who practiced what Ma preached, who met every expectation, who never quite gave Laura the trouble that Laura gave everyone else. 2 years later, on February 7th, 1867, the second daughter arrived, Laura Elizabeth Ingalls, dark-haired, curious, impossible to contain, the child who would eventually look back at everything and decide it was worth writing down. Caroline now had 2 daughters, a husband full of plans, and a family back in Wisconsin that was quietly falling apart in a way the Little House books would never explain. Because while Charles was looking west, the family Caroline had come from was absorbing another blow. Joseph, now 19 years old, stepped into the household after their father drowned in 1844 and held it together through force of sheer presence and labour, had enlisted in the Union Army. He was not the only Wisconsin man who did. Wisconsin sent more than 90,000 men into the Civil War, a staggering number for a young state with a modest population. Men from frontier families who had spent their lives building something from nothing, found in the Union caused both a duty and, for some, a way out of an existence that had always been one bad winter away from collapse. Joseph went, and in April of 1862, at a 2-day battle fought along the banks of the Tennessee River, the engagement that history would record as the Battle of Shiloh, and that both sides would remember as the moment they stopped believing the war would be short. Joseph Quiner was wounded. He died from those wounds. He was 35 years old. Think about what that number meant to Caroline. He was the same age her mother had been when the lake took their father, 36 years old, the same age, the same grief, a different generation. He was the man who had kept the family alive in the years when no one else could have done it. He was the brother whose presence in the household after 1844 had been the difference between a family that survived and a family that scattered. And now he was gone, killed in a war that was still 2 years from ending, on a battlefield 700 miles from the Wisconsin home he had spent years protecting. The historical record does not preserve Caroline's private response to Joseph's death. It does not give us a letter she wrote that week, or an account from a neighbour who saw her face when she heard the news. What the record gives us is silence, which, if you have been following this story from the beginning, you already know was Caroline's native language when it came to the things that hurt most. She kept going. Charles had plans. There were children to raise. There was work to be done. And somewhere in 1863 or 1864, another Quiner brother died too. The historical record on Thomas and Henry Jr. is thin enough that exact dates cannot be stated with certainty. But what multiple biographical sources confirm is that Caroline outlived most of the men she grew up alongside. Father, then brothers. The family that Charlotte had kept together through years of grinding effort was, across the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, quietly losing its male members one by one. If there is a pattern in Caroline's life that explains Ma Ingalls, the woman who never leaned, never buckled, never let her children see her bend, this is it. Not one catastrophe, a sequence of them, spaced just far enough apart that there was always time to recover before the next one arrived. In 1869, Charles looked at a map and made a decision. Kansas. The federal government had been negotiating with the Osage Nation for access to land in the southern part of the state. Charles, like thousands of other settlers in that period, read the situation as an opportunity rather than a warning. The land was there. The government seemed to be moving toward opening it. If you got there first, you stood a better chance of claiming what you wanted. What Charles did not entirely account for, or accounted for and chose to set aside, was that the Osage had not yet agreed to anything. The family loaded into a covered wagon. Caroline packed what a household required for a journey of roughly 700 miles across terrain that had no guarantee of safety, no established supply stations, and no obligation to accommodate a family that had shown up ahead of the official paperwork. She was 30 years old. She had 2 daughters, ages 4 and 2. She was pregnant with the third. The child born in Carrie, Caroline Celestia Ingalls, arrived on August 3rd, 1870, by which point the family was already in Kansas and already living in the particular tension that comes with settling on land that belongs to someone else. The Ingalls family built a house roughly 13 miles from the town of Independence in Montgomery County, Kansas, in what was technically Osage Nation territory. Their neighbours were in the same position, settlers who had arrived ahead of legal confirmation, hoping the government would resolve the question in their favour before anyone was asked to leave. In Laura's later account in Pioneer Girl, her unedited memoir written around 1930, she captured what that Kansas period actually felt like from inside the family. The sound of Osage men moving past the cabin at night, the conversations that stopped when children entered the room, the unspoken awareness that the adults knew something the children were not being told in full. Ma knew. She always knew. She managed that knowledge the same way she managed everything she couldn't change, by maintaining the household as though it were permanent, as though the walls around her family were solid, as though dinner at a regular hour and clean dresses on Sunday and a mother who did not visibly panic were sufficient bulwarks against the uncertainty pressing in on every side. In 1871 the government made it clear. The Osage had not ceded the land. The settlers had to go. Charles packed the wagon again. Caroline repacked what she had unpacked in Kansas. They went back to Pepin, Wisconsin, with nothing to show for the Kansas venture except the miles they had covered and the year they had spent in a house that was never legally theirs. She was 32 years old. She had been moving for a decade. She did not stop. By 1874, Charles had a new plan. Walnut Grove, Redwood County, Minnesota. Plum Creek. A dugout in the earth, not a house. A hole in the ground covered over with sod, close enough to the creek that in wet seasons the bank was unstable, and in dry seasons the creek disappeared entirely. This was where the family lived, while Charles built something better. This is the period Laura would later write into On the Banks of Plum Creek, smoothed and brightened for her young readers, until the dugout sounded almost cosy. It was not cosy. It was a hole in the ground. And then the grasshoppers came. In the summer of 1874, the Rocky Mountain locust descended on the Minnesota prairie, in numbers that defied any comfortable description. Contemporary accounts from across the region describe the sky going dark in the middle of the day, the sound of them landing like rainfall, the particular horror of watching every green thing you had planted and tended and counted on simply disappear. Crops gone. Gardens stripped to bare soil. Wooden tool handles gnawed through. Wool chewed from the backs of sheep still standing in the field. The locusts came back in 1875, and again in 1876. 3 consecutive seasons of agricultural catastrophe on land that had already been uncertain. 3 years of watching a harvest fail before it could be gathered, of calculating what the family could survive on, of making the kind of decisions about food and money and dignity that no one who has not been that close to the edge can fully understand from the outside. Caroline was in her mid-30s. She had 3 daughters and a husband who remained, through all of it, genuinely convinced that something better was ahead. She kept the house. She kept the girls in clean clothes when cleaning them required real effort. She kept a routine, meals at regular hours, prayers before bed, Sunday observance regardless of how discouraging Saturday had been, because routine was not decoration in her household. Routine was the thing that told the children the world was still operating according to predictable rules even when it obviously was not. She had learned this from Charlotte. Charlotte had maintained order in a Brookfield Township household after the lake took Henry, not because order was comfortable, but because it was the visible evidence that the family was still a family, that it had not come apart. Caroline was doing the same thing now a generation later, in a sod dugout in Minnesota, with the grasshoppers eating the dreams outside and a husband already thinking about the next plan, and then, in November of 1875, something happened that none of the published Little House books would ever fully stop and honour. A son was born, Charles Frederick Ingalls. They called him Freddie. He was the only boy, the only son. In a culture where sons were the expected future of a family's land and labour, where a man with daughters but no son carried a particular quiet weight about what would happen to everything he was building, Freddie's arrival meant something that went beyond simple addition to the family. He was the continuation that Charles had been working toward. He was the one who would carry the name forward. He was born in the worst possible season, in the middle of the grasshopper years, to a family that had almost nothing, and he was welcomed anyway with everything his parents had left to give. Caroline, 35 years old, knew how to love something carefully. She had been doing it her whole life. She had learned early that love was not a guarantee. She had learned that the things you held most closely were sometimes the very things the world took first. She held Freddie carefully. She held him the way a woman holds something she's already half afraid to lose. And if you have been paying attention to what this story has been building towards since the first chapter, if you've been watching the pattern in the family record, the way the men and boys in Caroline's life kept becoming absences, then you already feel what is coming. But before we go there, you need to understand something about what happened to this family in Burr Oak, Iowa, in 1876. Because it is the chapter that Laura almost entirely left out, and what got left out tells us more about both of them, mother and daughter, than almost anything that made it into the books. August 27th, 1876. Charles Frederick Ingalls had been alive for 9 months and 26 days. All of that collapsed on a late August day in 1876 into those 9 months of being, and then nothing. He never made it to his first birthday. There is something particular about the death of an infant that separates it from every other kind of loss. It is not like losing a parent, where grief arrives weighted with memory. Years of a voice, a face, a presence you have organised your daily life around. It is not like losing a sibling, where the shared history of a childhood makes the absence physically strange. Like a room you walk into 100 times expecting someone to be there. The death of an infant is the loss of a future tense. Everything Freddie was going to be. The conversations that were never going to happen. The person Charles had quietly been imagining carrying the name forward. The son the family had been waiting for through 3 daughters, and a decade of moves and grasshoppers and failed harvests and packed wagons. All of that collapsed on a late August day in 1876 into 9 months and 26 days of being, and then nothing. Caroline had lost men before. She had lost her father as a child and her brother to a Tennessee battlefield, and watched the broader Quiner family record thin out across 2 decades of quiet deaths in the background of her adult life. But she had never before been the mother. She had always been the daughter, the sister, the woman who held the household together while other people did the grieving they could not stop themselves from doing. She had always been the one standing upright while loss moved through the room. This was different. This was hers. And the historical record, in one of its most pointed silences, gives us almost nothing about what Caroline looked like in the days after August 27th, 1876. No letter, no neighbour's account, no diary entry where she tried to put words to what a woman puts into 9 months of loving something, and then has to find a way to keep living after it is gone. What the record gives us is what came next, because they had to keep moving. The family did not stay in Minnesota after Freddie died. There was nothing left to stay for. 3 consecutive years of locust devastation had taken the crops. The land Charles had staked his plans on had not produced what he needed it to produce. They owed money, and now the boy they had brought into the middle of all that struggle, the one who was supposed to be the reason the struggle was worth it, was buried in a Minnesota grave that the family would leave behind when they left. In 1876, the Ingalls family moved to Burr Oak, Iowa. Most people who love the Little House books have never heard of Burr Oak. That is not an accident. Laura Ingalls. Wilder wrote 9 books about her childhood. She wrote about the big woods of Wisconsin and the Kansas Prairie and the banks of Plum Creek and the long winter in Dakota Territory. She wrote about dugouts and log cabins and claim shanties and the particular smell of a new town being built from scratch on the open plains. She did not write about Burr Oak, she almost entirely skipped it. In her original memoir manuscript, Pioneer Girl, written around 1930 before the published novels existed, there is a version of the Burr Oak period, brief, careful, deliberately thin. By the time the Little House series was shaped into books for children, Burr Oak had been removed almost entirely. The year the family spent there simply does not appear on the narrative map that millions of American readers grew up with, which means that for most of the people who grew up reading those books, there is a gap in the story they never knew existed, a missing year, a missing grief, and a mother who was living through both. The Masters Hotel stood in the small town of Burr Oak, Iowa. It was run by a man named William Stedman, who had offered Charles Ingalls a position there, helping manage the hotel, doing the kind of labour a capable man could turn his hand to when farming had stopped being a viable option. It was not the life Charles had been building toward. It was the life that exists in the space between plans, where you do what you have to do until you can figure out what comes next. The family lived in the hotel, not in a private home, not on a piece of land they could call their own, in a public establishment where strangers came and went, where meals were served to boarders, where the rhythms of a household were subordinated to the rhythms of commerce, and where privacy, the private space that grief requires, the room you close the door on so that no one has to watch you, was not reliably available. Carolyn cooked, in a hotel kitchen for paying guests, while her family occupied whatever space the hotel's operation left for them. Sit with that for a moment. A woman who had just buried her only son, who had been moving across the Midwest for nearly a decade, who was managing 3 daughters while living in a boarding house that belonged to someone else, who had been carrying grief since she was 5 years old, and had never once in the documented record allowed it to become the loudest thing in any room she occupied. She cooked for strangers, because that was what the situation required, because stopping was not language Carolyn Ingalls had ever learned to speak. There was one more child born in Burr Oak. On May 23rd, 1877, Carolyn gave birth to her 4th daughter, Grace Pearl Ingalls, the youngest, the one who would grow up in Smet, Dakota Territory, and eventually marry a farmer named Dow and settled in Manchester, South Dakota, and live a life that was largely ordinary and mostly quiet, and almost entirely separate from the literary fame that would eventually swallow her family's name. Grace was born in Burr Oak, in the same year the family was trying to find its footing again, after the worst stretch they had yet survived. She arrived into a household still shaped by a loss that nobody was talking about directly. The way families absorb a death and keep going and stop mentioning the name because mentioning it makes the wound fresh again, and there is too much work to keep the wound fresh. By 1877, the family left Burr Oak and went back to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Back to the place the grasshoppers had taken 3 crops from. Back to the community they had left when leaving seemed like the only rational response to consecutive failure. There is something in that return that the Little House books never quite account for. The particular complicated feeling of going back to a place you left because it wasn't working, and needing it to work anyway, because the alternative turned out to be worse. Caroline unpacked again. She had done this so many times that packing and unpacking were no longer experiences. They were just tasks. You did them because the next place required it, and then you did them again when the next place after that required it too. But Walnut Grove was not going to hold them. By 1879, Charles had turned his attention east, and then sharply north. Dakota Territory, where the railroad was pushing into new ground and the government was opening land for homesteading, and where a man who still believed in the transforming power of a good piece of ground could stake a claim and build something that might finally stay built. He was going to be right about that one. But before the family reached the stability of Smet, before Laura's last and longest chapter began, one more thing had to happen, and it was the cruelest thing yet. In the winter of 1879, Mary Ingalls got sick. She was 14 years old. The illness came on the way illnesses did in that era, suddenly, severely, with none of the diagnostic certainty that might have helped the family understand what was happening in time to change the outcome. The family called it brain fever. That was the language available to them, a catch-all term for any severe neurological illness that produced fever, delirium, and the terrifying constellation of symptoms that meant something had gone wrong, deep inside the body that no 19th century medicine could reach. In 2013, a team of medical historians published a study in the journal Pediatrics, Beth Torini and her colleagues, examining the historical evidence for what Mary Ingalls actually had. Their conclusion was that the most likely diagnosis was viral meningoencephalitis, a single condition involving simultaneous inflammation of both the brain and the meninges, the protective membrane surrounding it. This specific condition can cause inflammation of the optic nerve, producing exactly the kind of devastating vision loss Mary experienced. In 1879, that diagnosis did not exist in those terms. In 1879, what existed was a 14-year-old girl who had been healthy and was now gravely ill, in a household that had no physician close enough to matter and no treatment that would have made a significant difference even if there had been. The illness attacked Mary's optic nerves. When she recovered, and the fact that she recovered at all was not guaranteed, given what brain fever could do to a 19th century child with no access to the interventions that would eventually make such illnesses survivable, she could not see, not dimly, not partially. The sight was gone. Mary Ingalls, who had been the fair-haired, serious firstborn who met every expectation and exceeded most of them, who had been her mother's most reliable model of propriety and grace, was permanently blind at 14 years old. Laura Ingalls Wilder, in her unedited memoir Pioneer Girl, wrote about the period after Mary's illness with a directness that the published novels soften considerably. There is a passage in Pioneer Girl in which Laura describes coming upon her mother privately. In one of those rare, unguarded moments that families stumble into when they don't realise someone else is nearby. Ma was weeping, quietly, alone. Not the visible grief of a woman who had stopped managing herself, but the private, contained grief of a woman who had found the one moment when no one needed her to be steady, and had allowed herself to be something other than steady, briefly, in the only space the day had left her. Laura saw it, and then she left. She did not interrupt. She did not say anything. She walked away and gave her mother the only gift she could give, the privacy to feel what she was feeling without having to explain it or contain it for someone else's comfort. That moment in Pioneer Girl is one of the most important sentences in the entire story of who Ma Ingalls really was. Not because it reveals weakness, because it reveals exactly how much was happening behind the composure that everyone around Caroline took for granted. She wept. Of course she wept. She had buried an infant son. She had watched a decade of plans fail and succeed, and fail again across 5 states. She had managed her husband's restlessness and her children's needs and her own private inheritance of loss with a discipline that would have broken most people years earlier, and she had a daughter who had just gone blind. That weeping, quiet, private, allowed only in the absence of observers, was not a crack in her. It was evidence that the woman inside the composure was real, that the grief had somewhere to go, even if it only went there when the room was empty. It is the one moment in the historical record where you see the seam. What happened next says more about Caroline than almost anything else in her life. She figured out what to do, not emotionally, not in the sense of making peace with something that resisted peace, in the practical, concrete, specific way that Caroline had always responded to impossible situations. She identified what the situation required, and she arranged for it to happen. Mary needed to be educated. The blindness had not taken Mary's intelligence, her seriousness, her capacity to learn. It had taken her sight, which in 1879 meant it had taken the primary means by which most people in her world expected to access knowledge. But Caroline knew, because she had been the daughter of a woman who treated education as the one possession that couldn't be removed, because she had been the stepdaughter of a schoolteacher, because she had stood in front of her own classroom and understood what learning meant for the people who received it, that Mary's education did not have to end. It had to change. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, was the institution that existed for exactly this purpose. It was 600 miles from Smet, Dakota Territory, where the family would soon settle. 600 miles in 1879 was not a casual distance. It was not something you arrange with a phone call or a quick trip. It was correspondence, coordination, money the family did not have in abundance, and a mother making the kind of decision that required her to simultaneously hold the grief of what had happened, and the practical determination to make certain it did not define the entire remainder of her daughter's life. Mary enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind in 1881. She would study there for years. She would learn to read using New York Point, a raised dot system that was the tactile reading method of her era, similar in principle to what would later become standardized as Braille but distinct from it. She would also study music. She would become accomplished in ways that blindness had not prevented, in an institution that had been specifically designed to give people with her condition something beyond the silence that most families in that era offered their blind children as the only available option. Caroline made that happen. Not Laura. Not Charles. Carolyn, who had been organising the survival of people around her since she was 5 years old and understood that survival required action and not just endurance. She got Mary into that school, and then she packed the wagon again. By 1879, the family was moving for what would turn out to be the last time. Smet, Dakota Territory, the place that would finally stop moving. Charles had gone ahead to work for the railroad surveying crew. The family followed, and as they travelled into Dakota Territory, crossing the open prairie that felt like the edge of the world to anyone who had grown up in the forested east, there was a moment, recorded in the Little House books, softened for young readers, but present, where the landscape changed so completely that even the Ingalls family, seasoned travellers with years of covered wagons behind them, felt the difference. This was not Minnesota. This was not Kansas. This was something else entirely. Wide, flat, relentlessly open land where the sky was enormous and the weather had nowhere to hide before it arrived. Land where a winter that decided to be brutal had nothing standing between it and you. Land where you either built something that lasted or discovered that the prairie was indifferent to whether you survived. Caroline was 40 years old. She had lived in at least 9 different homes. She had buried a son, carried a brother's battlefield death, managed a daughter's blindness, cooked for strangers in a hotel kitchen, replanted after locusts, repacked after governments changed their minds, and held 4 daughters together through every mile of it. She was not tired, or rather, she was tired in the way that people who have decided that tiredness is not a reason to stop are tired. She carried it quietly, the way she carried everything, folded into the work and the routine and the daily maintenance of a household that needed her to keep going. Smet was going to ask everything about her, because the winter that was coming to Dakota Territory in 1880 was not like any winter the family had faced before. 7 months. 7 months of blizzards were so severe that the supply train stopped running, that the town of Smet was cut off from the outside world from October through April, that the questions stopped being about plans and comfort and next year's crop and became the oldest question a human being can face. How do you keep the people you love alive when everything outside is trying to kill them? That question had one answer, and it wore a calico dress, and it kept the meals regular, and it never, in front of the children, showed them that she already knew how bad it could get. The winter of 1880 arrived in Dakota Territory before anyone had finished preparing for it. Not the gradual cooling that gives a family time to calculate, to estimate how much wood is stacked, how much flour remains in the barrel, whether the animals are sheltered well enough and the roof sealed tightly enough, and the family strong enough to outlast whatever the next 4 months decide to throw at them. This winter arrived like a door slamming. The first blizzard hit in October of 1880. Then another came before the first one had fully cleared, then another after that. By November, the supply trains running into Smet, Dakota Territory, had stopped. The tracks were buried. The locomotives could not push through the drifts that the wind built and rebuilt faster than any crew could shovel them away. The town was sealed, and it stayed sealed. Not for a week, not for a month. From October of 1880 until April of 1881, 7 months, Smet was cut off from the supply lines that connected it to the rest of the country. The food that existed inside the town when the blizzard started was the food the town had to live on until spring. The Ingalls family did not have enough flour. What they had was wheat. Raw, unground wheat that was useless until it was turned into something edible. Charles and Laura ground it by hand, using a small coffee grinder, for hours every single day. They took turns at it. The grinder was not designed for this. Their hands ached. The wheat came out coarse and uneven, and Caroline baked it into bread that was rough and dense and nowhere near what bread was supposed to be. It kept them alive. And while Charles and Laura ground wheat, and while the blizzards stacked themselves one on top of another outside the walls of the small house, Caroline managed everything else. She rationed what remained of their food with the particular precision of a woman who had spent her entire life calculating how far a limited supply could stretch. She kept the stove burning without burning through their fuel too quickly. She maintained the household routines, meals served at predictable hours, the table set, the prayers said, the sewing done, the ordinary markers of daily life held firmly in place, because she understood something about those routines that went beyond habit. Routines, in a crisis, are not comfort. They are evidence. They tell the people inside the crisis that the person managing it has not lost confidence that there will be a tomorrow, that the next meal is being planned because the person planning it believes there will be one, that the household is functioning because its anchor has decided it is going to function and has not yet been convinced otherwise. Caroline held that position for 7 months. She never, in the documented record, let her daughters see her doubt it. There was one person in that house who was 13 years old in the winter of 1880, old enough to notice everything, and young enough that what she noticed was going to stay with her for the rest of her life. Laura had been watching her mother for 13 years by the time that winter arrived. She was very good at it. Laura Ingalls Wilder was the kind of child who remembered texture, not just events, not just the broad outline of what happened and when. She remembered the specific weight of a moment, what the room smelled like, what expression crossed a face, what was not said and why the not saying of it mattered. She noticed the difference between what adults told children and what adults communicated to each other when they thought the children weren't listening. She had grown up in a household where the gap between those two things was significant and constant. Ma told the children that everything was going to be fine. What the children could observe, if they were paying attention, was a woman performing certainty so precisely and so consistently that the performance itself was its own form of communication, not about the future being secure, but about the necessity of presenting it that way regardless. Laura was paying attention. She had been paying attention since Kansas, when she understood that the conversations that stopped when she entered a room were conversations about things the adults had decided children should not know. She had been paying attention in Burr Oak, when the family lived in a hotel and her mother cooked for strangers, and nobody discussed directly what had happened in Minnesota. She had been paying attention through every unpacking and repacking, every new town and new school and new set of neighbours, every morning when Caroline came to the breakfast table having made the private decision, somewhere between sleep and waking, to present another day of composure to the people who depended on her. What Laura was accumulating across all those years of watching was not just memory, it was an archive. And decades later, when she sat down to write, she opened it. The first version of the Little House story was not a children's book, it was a memoir. Around 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder, 63 years old, living on Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, the farm she and Almanzo had built over decades of their own hard labour, began writing down what she remembered of her childhood. She called it Pioneer Girl. It was not polished, it was not shaped for an audience. It was a woman in her 60s writing toward the past, with the specific urgency of someone who understands that the people she's writing about are mostly gone, and that if she does not put it down now, it will be lost. Pioneer Girl is the closest thing we have to Laura's unfiltered memory of Ma, and the Ma in those pages is different from the Ma in the published novels, not unrecognisable, but different in ways that matter enormously if you want to understand who Caroline Ingalls actually was. In Pioneer Girl, Ma argues with Pa, not viciously, not in ways that suggest a marriage in crisis, but with the direct, specific friction of two people who do not always agree and occasionally allow that disagreement to become audible. In the published novels, Ma and Pa present a united front with an almost seamless consistency. Disagreements, when they appear, are quickly resolved or quietly absorbed. The household they run in the books is one in which the parents' relationship functions as a kind of emotional infrastructure. Stable, predictable, reassuring. In Pioneer Girl, it is a real marriage between two real people. In Pioneer Girl, Ma is afraid sometimes. She lets the fear into her voice when the children are not quite young enough to be fully shielded from it. The Kansas period, which the published Little House on the Prairie presents, through a child's wide-eyed wonder, surfaces in Pioneer Girl with the lower register anxiety of a mother who understood the situation far more precisely than her children did, and who was not always able to keep every trace of that understanding off her face. And in Pioneer Girl, certain things that were removed from the published novels are present. Burr Oak is there, briefly. Freddie's existence is there. The rougher edges of a frontier childhood that a children's book series could not comfortably carry are present in Pioneer Girl in the way that real memory is always messier than narrative. But here is the thing that most people who love the Little House books have never been told. By the time those books reached readers, they had passed through another set of hands. Rose Wilder Lane was born on December 5th, 1886 in Smet, Dakota Territory, the first child of Laura and Almanzo Wilder. She grew up to become a professional writer, a journalist, a woman of significant skill and strong opinions who had spent her career developing a particular sense of how a story should move, what it should sound like, and what it needed to do to hold an audience. When Laura began writing what would eventually become the Little House series, Rose was her editor. That word, editor, does not fully capture it. William Holtz, in his 1993 scholarly work The Ghost in the Little House, documented through detailed archival research what happened between Laura's manuscripts and the published books. His conclusion, supported by the letters and drafts he examined, was that Rose's involvement went substantially beyond editing in the conventional sense. She rewrote, she restructured, she imposed her own sense of narrative shape and emotional tone onto material that Laura had provided. The Ma of the Little House novels, that beautifully composed, endlessly patient, almost saintly figure of frontier motherhood, is partly Rose's creation layered over Laura's memory. The fear that showed in Pioneer Girl was smoothed out. The arguments were quieted. The complexity of a real woman managing a genuinely difficult life was simplified into the kind of clarity that a children's book series requires, and that a talented professional writer knows how to construct. This is not a scandal. Rose was not stealing anything or falsifying history for malicious reasons. She was doing what editors and co-authors do, shaping raw material into something that could reach an audience, and the book she helped create became one of the most beloved series in American literary history. But the Ma who emerged from that process is not the full Caroline. She is Caroline seen through two lenses at once. Laura's memory, which was already protective and already shaped by the grief suppression she had inherited from the woman she was writing about, and Rose's craft, which had its own aesthetic priorities and its own sense of what a mother in a children's story should be. The real Caroline was more frightened, more tired, more human, and more complicated than either lens fully captured. Here is the detail about Laura that almost never makes it into the conversations about the Little House books. In August of 1889, Laura Ingalls Wilder gave birth to a son. He lived for 12 days. He died without a name being formally recorded in the surviving public record. Laura and Almanzo had already been through significant hardship by 1889. Drought, debt, diphtheria that left Almanzo partially paralysed, a house fire that destroyed what they had built. The death of the baby arrived in the middle of a period of loss that Laura would later describe with characteristic restraint, saying almost nothing about it directly in any public account. 12 days. She held him for 12 days and then he was gone, and she did not write about it in ways that left a full record. Think about where that response came from. She had watched her mother absorb the death of Freddie, 9 months and 26 days, and keep cooking, keep moving, keep presenting a functional household to the children who were watching. She had watched her mother weep privately once, in a moment she thought was unobserved. She'd grown up inside a system that said, "You carry the loss quietly. You do not allow it to become the organising event of your public life. You protect the people around you from the weight of it by making the weight invisible." When Laura's own son died, she did exactly what Caroline had always done. She went quiet. She kept going. The grief suppression that Charlotte Quiner had practiced in a Brookfield Township household after the lake took her husband in 1844, and that Caroline had absorbed as the grammar of how you survive catastrophe, and that had shaped every silent moment and every composed public face across 40 years of frontier life. That same pattern now lived in the daughter. Charlotte had passed it to Caroline. Caroline had passed it to Laura. And Laura, without knowing she was doing it, had passed it into the books. The mother who never cried in front of the children. The mother who managed fear with songs. The mother who could stand beside a stove in a blizzard and serve a meal with the quiet authority of a woman who had decided that today was survivable, and had decided it before anyone else in the room was awake enough to wonder. That mother was not invented. She was inherited. 3 generations of women, each one watching the one before her and learning that love, on the American frontier, often looked indistinguishable from endurance. And yet, there is something that gets lost when the story is told only this way, as a transmission, as an inheritance, as one woman's coping mechanism becoming another woman's character, becoming a literary archetype that millions of readers absorbed as the definition of pioneer strength. What gets lost is the cost. Charlotte paid for it first. She paid for it in 5 years of widowhood and remarriage, and a household held together by arithmetic when there was no room for emotion. Caroline paid it across 40 years of moving and planting and losing and packing and unpacking and planting again, across a son she buried and a daughter who went blind, and a winter that tried to starve her family inside a sealed Dakota Territory town. Laura paid for it in 12 unnamed days in August of 1889, in the restraint of everything she chose not to write. And here is what the books gave to America in return. A mother who was always steady. A mother who was always there. A mother who never showed her daughters the seam where the composure was sewn together, because showing the seam would have required admitting that the composure was constructed, and a constructed composure is one that can come apart, and coming apart was never an option. The books are not lies, but they are not the whole truth either. They are what Laura could bring herself to write about a woman she loved too specifically and too carefully to expose entirely on the page. And Caroline, who'd been dead for 8 years by the time the first novel was published, who never read a single page of the story her daughter built from her life, never got to say whether that was the version she would have chosen. That unanswered question is what the final chapters of this story have to carry. Because by the time Laura was sitting in Mansfield, Missouri, trying to put her childhood into words, Caroline had already lived out the end of her own story. She had grown old into Smet. She had watched her daughters leave, one by one, Mary to Iowa, Laura to a farm with Almanzo, Carrie and Grace eventually to their own lives and their own distances. She had stood beside Charles when he died, and then she had been alone, in a small house in De Smet, South Dakota, for 22 years. What that looked like. What it meant to be the woman who had held everything together across half a century of frontier survival, and then to find herself at the end of it in a quiet room without the people she had organised her entire life to protect, is what the next chapter has to answer. There is a particular silence that follows a life lived at full volume. Caroline Ingalls spent 40 years moving, managing, surviving, and holding things together through the kind of sustained effort that most people could not have maintained for a single decade. She packed wagons, she unpacked them, she planted gardens in ground that turned out to belong to someone else. She cooked for strangers in a hotel kitchen after burying her only son. She held her daughter's world together through blizzards that lasted 7 months, and illnesses that took sight and grief that never announced itself because she had been trained since childhood to give it no room. And then, slowly, the noise stopped. Not all at once, not in a single season. But over the span of years in De Smet, Dakota Territory, the place that finally stopped moving, the household that Caroline had spent her entire adult life organising began to empty around her, one daughter at a time, one departure at a time, until the house that had once held 5 children and a man with a fiddle and 40 years of accumulated survival held 2 aging women, one of whom could not see, and the particular quiet of a life that had outlasted most of what gave it its shape. When Charles filed his homestead claim on a piece of land roughly 1.5 miles north of de Smet under the Homestead Act of 1862, it was not the first land claim the family had staked. It was not the first time Charles had looked at a piece of ground and decided it was going to be the one that finally held. But it was different. Different because this time the paperwork would eventually go through. Different because de Smet was putting down the kind of permanent infrastructure, a school, a church, a newspaper, businesses, that told you the town was committed to being there. The population that had stood at roughly 350 people in 1880 had grown to somewhere around 850 by 1885. Streets were being laid. Buildings were going up in materials that said their owners intended to stay. The Dakota Territory that had felt like the edge of the world when the Ingalls family first arrived was year by year becoming a real town. Caroline finally had neighbours she was going to know for the rest of her life. That is not a small thing, coming from a woman who had spent a decade moving before anyone in the new place could learn her name. She joined the Congregational Church in de Smet. She became, in the specific way that women of her era became essential to frontier towns, part of the social fabric of the community, known, relied upon, present in the daily life of a place that was no longer a temporary stop. For the first time since her childhood in Brookfield, Wisconsin, she was staying. But staying, it turned out, did not mean holding still. Because the years in de Smet were the years when the household changed in the opposite direction from all the years before. Instead of adding people, it was losing them. Instead of packing for the next departure, Caroline was watching her daughters make their own departures. Mary had come home from the Iowa College for the Blind, not permanently surrendering to distance, but settling into a life that was arranged around her needs in de Smet. She returned to her parents. She lived in the family home through the 1880s and beyond. She could not see, but she was present. She attended church. She participated in the household. She was known and recognized and included in the life of the community in ways that would not have been available to a blind woman in a larger, less tight-knit world. For Caroline, Mary's presence was both a comfort and a continuing responsibility. She had fought to give Mary an education, and the education had done what Caroline believed education always did. It had given her daughter a form of competence that the blindness could not remove. But Mary still needed a household organised around her. She still needed someone to read to her, to describe what she could not see, to manage the practical dimensions of daily life that her blindness made difficult. Caroline did that, without announcement, without making it the defining conversation of anyone's day. It was simply what needed to be done, so it was done. And then, on August 25th, 1885, Laura married. His name was Almanzo James Wilder. He was a homesteader from the area, 10 years older than Laura, steady in the way that a man who has spent years farming difficult land in a difficult climate is steady. Not flashy, not full of the particular kind of hope that keeps moving to the next place, but present. Grounded. A man who had decided that this piece of ground was his piece of ground, and who was going to prove it by staying on it. The wedding was small, simple, in keeping with the Ingalls family's relationship to simplicity, which was less a philosophical choice than a practical one. They had what they had, and they used it well, and there was dignity in that whether anyone else recognised it or not. Caroline watched her daughter marry. She had been the daughter who watched most of her life. Now she was the mother watching. Laura and Almanzo would spend their first years near de Smet. They built on Almanzo's claim. They were close enough that Caroline could see them regularly, close enough that the distance between the households was measured in miles rather than the kind of days it had taken to cross between one life and the next when the family was still moving. Then came Rose. On December 5th, 1886, Laura gave birth to her first child, a daughter. They named her Rose Wilder Lane. Caroline was 47 years old when her granddaughter was born. Think about what that meant. Not in the abstract, sentimental way that the word grandmother sometimes gets used, but specifically. Caroline had spent the previous decade watching her own daughters grow into young women, watching Mary navigate blindness with a capability she had helped make possible, watching Laura become the kind of woman who had inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's restlessness in proportions that would eventually produce something extraordinary. And now there was Rose, a new small person to observe and learn and become. Caroline knew how to love carefully. She had been doing it since she was 5 years old. Rose grew up in Smet with her grandmother nearby. She grew up knowing the woman that millions of future readers would one day encounter as Ma Ingalls, not as a literary figure, not as a symbol of pioneer strength, but as a specific grandmother in a specific Dakota Territory town who had a specific history and a particular way of moving through a room. That is something worth holding for a moment. The woman Rose Wilder Lane would later help transform into American myth was, in Rose's early childhood, simply a grandmother, a woman who aged, who had habits and preferences and the accumulated particular quality of a personality that had been shaped by 80-something years of experience. Rose knew her, and decades later, when Rose sat down to reshape her mother's memories of that woman into something that millions of strangers could carry home in a book, she was working with a figure who had been real to her. By the early 1890s, Laura and Almanzo's time near Smet was ending. The drought years that hit the Dakota Territory in the late 1880s and early 1890s, the same drought that was stripping the plains of crops and hope and keeping farmers tethered to land that refused to produce, made staying difficult. In 1894, Laura and Almanzo packed their wagon and headed south and east to Mansfield, Missouri. 600 miles. Caroline watched them go. This was not the same as watching Charles pack the wagon and drive the family west toward a new territory. This was different. This was her daughter choosing to go. Her daughter and her son-in-law and her granddaughter, building their own life in their own direction. Caroline stayed in Smet. The household was smaller now. Mary was there. Charles was there. Older, but still himself. Still capable. Still present. Still the man who had made every plan and driven every wagon and played the fiddle at the end of every hard day with a conviction that tomorrow was worth looking forward to. Carrie, the daughter born in Kansas on a wagon journey in 1870, the third girl, the one who had spent her childhood in the middle of the family between the serious Mary and the irrepressible Laura, had stayed in Smet and was working as a printer's assistant, and then as a journalist for local South Dakota newspapers. She was practical and capable in the particular way that middle children of the large frontier families often are, having spent their formative years adapting to circumstances they did not create. She was close. She was there. Grace married in 1901 Nathan William Dow, a farmer. They settled in Manchester, South Dakota, which was close enough that the distance was real but not impossible. And then there were four, Charles and Carolyn and Mary and Carrie, in a Smet house that had held so much more, living the particular quiet life of a family that has survived everything it needed to survive, and is now simply enduring in the ordinary sense, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way of aging people in a small town who have become part of the landscape. June 8th, 1902. Charles Philip Ingalls was 66 years old. He died in Smet from what the death certificate described as dropsy, the 19th century term for the edema and fluid retention, now understood as likely related to heart failure. His body had simply worn out. The body of a man who had swung axes and driven wagons and ploughed fields and built cabins from raw timber across 30 years of frontier living had reached its limit. He was buried in the Smet cemetery. Caroline was 62 years old. She had been married to Charles Ingalls for 42 years. Laura was in Mansfield, Missouri when it happened. She did not reach Smet before her father died. The distance was what it was, and the illness moved faster than the notification could travel and be acted upon. By the time Laura could have arranged to come, Charles was already buried in the Dakota ground he had spent years trying to make produce something worth having. The historical record is thin on what Caroline said or wrote, or did in the weeks after Charles died. You already know why. She had been practicing silence around loss since 1844. She would have kept the house. She would have maintained the routines. She would have done what needed to be done, and she would not have given the neighbours evidence of a woman who could not manage her own grief. What was different this time, different from every loss that had come before, was that this loss took the one person who had been beside her through all of it. Her father had died before she could hold him in memory fully. Her brothers had died in wars and from illnesses that arrived without consultation. Her son had died before he could know her. But Charles had been there for 42 years, through Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota Territory, through the grasshoppers and the blizzards and the hotel kitchens and the homestead claims, through Mary's blindness and Laura's marriage and Rose's birth, and Almanzo and Laura's departure for Missouri. He had been there for all of it, and now he was not. What followed was 22 years. That is a number people rarely stop to consider when they think about Caroline Ingalls. She did not die quietly in the months after Charles. She did not simply withdraw from the story and waited for her own ending. She lived. She went on living in Smet for more than 2 decades after her husband was buried. Mary was with her. That is the detail the record provides, and it matters. The 2 women who had come through the most together. The mother who had organised everything around protecting the people she loved, and the daughter who had gone blind at 14 and come home from Iowa and built a life inside the limits that the blindness imposed, lived together in Smet through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The world around them changed in ways that neither could have predicted from a Dakota Territory homestead in 1880. The automobile arrived. The Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903, the year after Charles died. World War I killed a generation of young men between 1914 and 1918, and even in Smet, South Dakota, the names of men who had grown up in the same community as the Ingalls daughters appeared on the casualty lists that ran in the newspapers Carrie had worked to produce. Caroline was in her 70s. She had been born into Wisconsin Territory in 1839, in a household without electricity, without indoor plumbing, without any of the infrastructure that the 20th century was now installing around her as though it had always been there. She had been 5 years old in a world where a man could drown on Lake Michigan, and the news could take days to reach his family. She was now living in a world where telephones were becoming common, and the newspapers arrived with fresh ink. She had outlasted the frontier, not triumphantly, not in the way of someone who has defeated something, in the quiet, ordinary way of a person who simply kept living while the world reorganized itself around her. Carrie remained nearby. She eventually married David Swansea in 1912 and moved to the Black Hills of South Dakota, far enough that Caroline felt the distance, but not the unbridgeable kind of far. The daughters wrote letters. Laura wrote from Mansfield, Missouri. The letters arrived, and Caroline read them, or had them read to her in later years when her own eyes may have been less reliable than they once were. April 20th, 1924. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls was 84 years old. She had survived her father by 80 years. She had outlived the lake that took him, and the war that took Joseph, and the grasshoppers that took 3 harvests, and the blizzard that tried to take her family inside a sealed Dakota Territory town, and the infant son she buried in Minnesota, and the husband whose fiddle had been the warmth of her household for 4 decades. She died in Smet, South Dakota. She was buried in the Smet Cemetery, beside Charles. The stone that marks her grave is simple, a name, a date, the kind of inscription that does not try to summarize a life because no inscription could. Mary outlived her. Mary Ingalls, who had gone blind at 14 and come home from Iowa and lived beside her mother for the last decades of both their lives, survived Caroline by 4 years. She died in 1928, and she was buried in Smet too. The 2 of them, the mother who had managed everything, and the daughter who had lost her sight at 14 and rebuilt her life around what remained, had spent more years together as adults than most mothers and daughters manage. Quiet years. Years that the historical record does not fill in with drama or revelation, because the drama was done, and what remained was simply the daily work of living. Laura was in Mansfield. She received the news of her mother's death the way she received every difficult piece of news in her life, quietly. And then she sat with it for years, 6 years to be precise. Because in 1930, 6 years after Caroline died, Laura sat down in Missouri and began writing toward the past, writing toward Wisconsin and Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota Territory, writing toward the dugout and the grasshoppers and the long winter and the covered wagons and the man who played the fiddle, writing toward Ma, who was gone, who had been gone for 6 years, who had never read a word of what was coming. In April of 1932, a book arrived in American bookstores. It was published by Harper and Brothers, and it was called Little House in the Big Woods. The author was Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was 65 years old. The farm she and Almanzo had built together in Mansfield, Missouri was paid for. Her husband was alive, though slower now than the young man she had married in Smet in 1885. Rose was grown and accomplished and living a complicated, restless life of her own, the kind of life that carried unmistakable traces of a grandmother Caroline and a great-grandmother Charlotte in ways Rose herself may never have fully recognized. The book sold. It sold in a way that surprised the publisher and surprised Laura, and did not, in the end, surprise anyone who understood what the country was living through at that moment. America in 1932 was 2 years into the Great Depression. Banks had failed. Families had lost savings. Men who had worked steady jobs were lining up for bread. The idea of a childhood that was hard but survivable. A family that had almost nothing and built everything from what they could manage, landed on the American imagination with the particular force of something people desperately needed to believe was possible. The timing was, in retrospect, everything. But here is what the timing also meant. The woman at the centre of that book, the woman whose particular way of moving through a room and maintaining a household and managing fear without showing it, had given the novel its emotional backbone. That woman had been dead for 8 years. Caroline Ingalls died in April of 1924. Little House in the Big Woods was published in April of 1932. 8 years. 8 years of silence between the death of the woman and the publication of the story. And somewhere on the dedication page of that first novel, in the front matter that most readers skim past on their way to the story, there were 4 words. To Charles and Caroline Ingalls. That is all. No explanation, no elaboration, no sentence that says what those 2 names meant, what it cost to carry them, what 42 years of marriage and 9 homes and a son buried in Minnesota, and a daughter who lost her sight, and 7 months of Dakota winter had actually looked like from the inside. Just the names. 4 words. Carrying everything Laura could not bring herself to say directly on any other page. There is a temptation, when you have been following this story as long as we have been following it tonight, to arrive at this moment and feel something like relief. The books came, the story was told. The woman who held everything together through every impossible thing the 19th century American frontier could produce was finally, however imperfectly, however shaped by Laura's love and Rose's craft and the requirements of a children's book series, given to the world. That is one way to read it. But there is another way, and it requires sitting with a specific question that the historical record cannot answer, but that the story keeps asking anyway. What would Caroline have thought of these books? Not whether she would have been grateful or proud or touched that her daughter had chosen to honour the family's life in this particular form. The answer to those questions is probably yes, with complicated reservations. She loved Laura. She understood the importance of putting things into records. She valued, as we have seen from the very beginning of this story, the particular permanence of things that could be written down. But would she have recognised herself in those pages? In the Ma who almost never breaks? In the woman who manages every fear with a song and every crisis with a steady hand, and every difficult season with the particular serenity of someone who has already made peace with the worst? Would she have recognised that woman as herself? Or would she have recognised what Laura needed her to be? The scholar Anne Ramirez, in her 1997 study, Constructing the Little House, wrote about the ways in which Laura's novels participate in the construction of a particular kind of domestic mythology, where the home is a space of order and safety, and the woman at the centre of that home is its guarantor, its architect, its permanently reliable presence. Ramirez argues that these books are not simply stories about the past. They are arguments about what home should mean, what mothers should be, what femininity in the domestic sphere requires of the woman who inhabits it, and Caroline is the proof of concept. The evidence that it is possible to maintain that domestic order under any conditions, that a woman of sufficient character and sufficient faith and sufficient discipline can hold a household together through anything the world decides to throw at it. That is a beautiful argument. It is also, if you have been paying attention to Caroline's actual life, an argument that erases a great deal of what made that order possible. What Laura preserved in the books was real. The butter making, the way Caroline managed the household's food production with an efficiency born of years of calculating whether there was enough and what to do when there was not. The sewing, the mending, the particular skill of making clothing that would last through a prairie winter when there was no way to simply replace it. These things are in the books, and they are accurate, and they give readers something genuinely true about the texture of frontier domestic life. The music is in the books too. Pa's fiddle is one of the most enduring images of the entire Little House series. The father playing at the end of a hard day, filling the cabin with something warm and alive. But what the books capture less fully is what Caroline was doing while the fiddle played. She was creating the conditions in which music could exist. She was the one who had made the meal and banked the fire and gotten the children ready for sleep and managed the 100 small acts of daily maintenance that made the evening feel like rest rather than collapse. The fiddle filled the room. Caroline made the room. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. But it tends to disappear into the background in the books, the way women's labour has always tended to disappear into the background of the stories men and even daughters sometimes tell about shared lives. What Laura softened was also real. The exhaustion. That is the word the books almost never use in connection with Caroline. Tired occasionally, worn perhaps after the longest winters, but exhausted. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been managing the physical and emotional labour of a frontier household, while simultaneously carrying decades of unprocessed grief and continuing to function as the household's emotional anchor through every fresh catastrophe. That word does not appear, because Laura needed Ma to be inexhaustible, not because she was lying, not because she was being careless with the truth, but because the child who had grown up watching Caroline Ingalls hold everything together had absorbed somewhere very deep the belief that Ma's endurance was structural, that it was not something Ma was doing with enormous effort and enormous cost, that it was simply who Ma was. That belief was how a child survived a childhood like Laura's. If Caroline was inexhaustible, then the world was survivable. If Ma could always be steady, then the blizzards and the grasshoppers and the packed wagons and the hotel kitchens were manageable, because the person managing them would never run out. A child cannot afford to know that the person holding everything together is also barely holding. Laura had glimpsed it once, that private weeping in a room she had stumbled into by accident, and she had walked away. She had given her mother back the privacy. She had not written about it in the published novels. She wrote around it instead, and in writing around it, she gave America a mother who was everything a frightened child needed a mother to be. Whether that was entirely fair to Caroline is a question that belongs not to judgment, but to understanding. Here is what Laura's books gave to the country, and it is important to say this plainly. They gave readers, millions of them across generations, across the decades since 1932 when that first novel appeared, a story about endurance that felt both true and bearable. They gave children a picture of hardship that did not destroy the family at its centre. They gave women, particularly, a kind of recognition. Yes, the domestic work is real. Yes, the effort required to maintain a household is significant. Yes, what mothers do is worth putting on the page. Those are not small gifts. The Little House series is one of the most widely read children's book series in American history. It shaped how generations of Americans imagined the frontier, the family, and the particular resilience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It did that because Laura had been watching very carefully for many years, and because what she had watched was genuinely worth preserving. But here is the word this chapter cannot avoid. The version of Caroline that Laura gave to America was the version that could be given to children. It was the version that could be given to a country in the middle of a depression that needed to believe in the survivability of hardship. It was the version that Laura could live with, that she could sit down in Missouri and write without falling apart, because falling apart was never something the women in this lineage had been taught to do in front of observers. The full version, the one that includes the hotel kitchen after the infant's burial, and the private weeping after the blindness, and the 42 years of managing a restless man's ambitions through 9 different homes, and the 5-year-old girl in Brookfield who learned the lesson that grief must be invisible before she was old enough to understand what grief was. That version is harder. It is harder because it asks something of the reader that a children's book cannot ask. It asks you to look at strength and ask what it cost. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls was not strong the way mountains are strong. She was not strong because she was built differently from ordinary people, or because she had been given some particular gift of temperament that other women lacked. She was strong the way water in a difficult landscape is strong. It keeps moving, because stopping means dying. It finds the available path not because the path is obvious, but because the alternative is stagnation. It does not announce its effort. It does not stop to commemorate how far it has come. It moves because movement is the only available form of existence. That is not a metaphor the Little House books use. But it is, if you have spent tonight following Caroline's life from the beginning, the closest thing to the truth. She was 5 years old when she learned that men in her family could become absences without warning. She was 9 when her mother rebuilt the household around a new person and a new kind of stability. She was 20 when she married a man whose restlessness she recognized because she had grown up alongside something like it. She was 36 when she buried her son. She was 39 when her daughter went blind. She was 41 when she held the household together through 7 months of Dakota winter. She was 62 when the person who had been beside her through all of it was buried in the Smet cemetery, and she kept going. Not because she was a saint, not because she'd found some secret to surviving catastrophe that other women lacked, but because Charlotte Quiner's household had taught her, before she had words for it, that continuation was the only available response to loss. That the children watching needed to see the household standing, that grief was real and private and completely unable to interrupt the work. She was not Serenity, she was practice continuation. And there is a difference that matters. Serenity suggests peace. It suggests a woman who has arrived somewhere restful, who has made her peace with the world's difficulty and now moves through it from a place of quiet acceptance. Practiced continuation is something else entirely. It is the thing you do in the morning because yesterday you did it, and the day before and the year before, and because the household is still there and the children are still watching, and the fire still needs to be tended. It is not optimism. It is not even hope, necessarily. It is simply the muscle memory of a woman who learned before she was old enough to resist the lesson that stopping was not a language her life allowed. Laura gave America serenity. Caroline had continuation. There is a last thing to say, and it belongs to Caroline rather than to the books, or to the scholarship, or to anything Laura built from her life. Before she was Ma, before she was any of the things the literary record made of her, she was a girl in Brookfield, Wisconsin. She was 5 years old. The lake had just taken her father, and the household was trying to figure out how to stand back up, and her mother was doing the thing that women in that era did when the world removed its structural support. She kept moving, she kept the children dressed and fed and present. She maintained the household standing in the community, and she did not let anyone see how close to the edge she was standing, and the 5-year-old girl watched. She watched, and she learned, and she carried what she learned into the schoolroom, and into the marriage, and into the covered wagons, and into the hotel kitchen, and into the 7-month winter, and into the 22 years of de Smet widowhood that followed Charles's death. She carried it all the way to April 20th, 1924, when she was 84 years old, and the lessons she had learned in a Wisconsin Territory childhood finally finished travelling. 8 years later, her daughter opened the archive and gave America the version it could hold. But this version, the full one, the one that begins with a 5-year-old girl and ends with an 84-year-old woman and includes everything in between that Laura loved her too carefully to fully expose, this version is the one that tells the truth. Not just about Caroline, about what it has always cost in this country, in this history, to be the woman holding things together, The woman nobody thinks to ask if she is tired, because she never looks tired, because she learned, before she had the words, that looking tired was not something the work allowed. Her name was Caroline, and she was so much more than Ma. If this story reached you tonight, subscribe. There are more women like Caroline whose full story history left out. This channel is where we find them,